Damn good. Hello, Bobby Torres of Frightbox Recording. Now, if you're anything like I was, maybe you're not so happy with the way your recordings and mixes are currently turning out. Maybe you're thinking to yourself, if I only had better plugins, if I only had a better vocal microphone, or nicer mic preamps, or a better interface, if I just had these things, my recordings and mixes will sound more professional. Well, unfortunately, I've got some bad news for you. Upgrading your gear and buying nicer plugins or microphones or whatever will not make your recordings and mixes any better than they currently are. And believe me, I've learned this the hard way, and that's what I want to share with you in this video. Let's dive into it. So since starting this YouTube channel, I get emails all the time where people will send me their mixes and they'll say they're not happy with their guitar tone or their vocal production or the way that their drums sound. And they'll always ask me what plugins I recommend. What amp sim software should they upgrade to? What vocal mic should they use or upgrade to? And if I'm being honest, I absolutely cringe when I read these emails because you know what? This used to be me. And like I mentioned earlier in this video, I learned my lessons the hard way, believe me. And I don't want you going through this. I want you to be fully aware of the truth behind home recording gear, or recording gear in general. Now, back when I got into production in the mid-2000s, whenever I wasn't happy with my results, I would always blame the gear. I always thought that the reason why my mixes and recordings didn't sound professional is because I was missing something. It's my cheap interface. It's my cheap microphones. It's my room, whatever. Well, it turns out I was completely off base and I was 100% incorrect about this. And I want to share a simple story that clearly illustrates this point, because this one lesson alone completely changed my life and saved me a lot of money in the long run. And I want you to learn from this as well. So after I earned my degree in audio production and I graduated from college, and even after my internship, I was so busy recording a ton of independent and local bands in my area. And I was slowly getting better at my craft, but there was one thing that I really struggled with, and that was drums. Recording live drums can be challenging. Most bands have drummers, and drummers want to play on their records. It's totally understandable. Now, to be even more specific, I would struggle with cymbals on drums. My cymbals would always be really, really harsh, really ear-piercing. And drummers would always ask me, can you turn up my china? Can you turn up my crashes? But whenever I would do this, the hi-hats would destroy my mixes, and I didn't know what to do. No matter how much EQ I used, or no matter what plugin I upgraded to, or what microphones I even used, the results were always the same. Bad sounding cymbals that I had no control over. And what frustrated me most about this is when I would listen to my favorite records, the cymbals generally would sound really smooth. You would hear everything nice and clear. The china, the crashes, the hi-hats, the ride cymbal. But when it came to my mixes, even though they were getting better over time, the cymbals just never sounded right. It was so annoying. So like most other people, what I decided to do was turn to the internet and go into online forums. And the number one thing, of course, that people would tell me is that, oh man, you're using cheap microphones. You need to upgrade your microphones. Oh man, you're using a cheap interface. Your converters are horrible. You need better converters. Oh, your room is terrible. You need better acoustic treatment. All this crazy stuff that would have cost me thousands of dollars to upgrade. Now, at the time, I was using budget gear, and I pretty much still use budget gear to this day. I was using an old DIGI 2 Firewire interface, which was just a budget 8-channel interface. I was also using a couple of different condenser microphones. I was using Samson CO2s, which I still use to this day, as well as a couple of Shure SM81s, which are solid condenser microphones. And I was recording on a 2006 MacBook Pro with 2 gigs of RAM using only plugins, no outboard gear. And that's another thing. People were saying, well, you're not using outboard gear. That's why your cymbals sound terrible and why your mixes aren't great. And you know what? After a while, after years of struggling with this, I actually started to believe these people. And I started putting money aside for some Neumann microphones, which are great microphones. I even thought about upgrading to Apogee converters. I even planned on buying some Neve preamps and API preamps for my project studio. I even looked into upgrading my acoustic treatment. Luckily, I didn't have to do any of that. I ended up coming across an article with one of my favorite producers. His name is Andy Sneap, and he mentioned in this article that the way that he records cymbals is that he spot mics his cymbals to avoid the hi-hat. Now this is pretty ridiculous because at the time I'd already gone through an entire internship. I was around pro records being made and I never really paid close attention to where the engineers were putting the cymbal microphones. I was sort of reverting back to what I learned in school, but here's the problem. Most of the artists we were recording in school, in college, were jazz, which is great. I love jazz, but metal and rock are very different than jazz. Jazz drummers are typically not going to want to hear their China cymbals blasting loud in the mix. It's a completely different thing. So I had a band coming in, shout out to Seasick. They were a band called Seasick, and I decided to do an experiment or run an experiment. I mic'd my cymbals closer. I didn't change anything. I didn't upgrade any of my gear. I was using the exact same microphones and interface that I've always used. And lo and behold, I magically had the cymbal sound that I always wanted. The hi-hat sounded nice and smooth. Of course, the drummer asked me to turn up his China and his ride. I was able to do so, all by just changing the microphone placement and miking my cymbals closer. To demonstrate how drastic of a difference this made, let's jump into my DAW and I'm gonna play some audio samples back for you. Let's check it out. All right, well, here we are in my DAW and I have two mixes pulled up. One is of a production that I did back in 2009 and another is of a production that I did in 2011. Now, mind you, I was using the exact same gear, microphones, interface, plugins, everything in both of these examples. So I'm gonna play the one from 2009 and I want you to pay close attention to the drums and more specifically, the cymbals. Let's take a listen. Oh, brutal. I mean, not only is the mix pretty terrible, but if you listen to the cymbals, they're ear piercing. I mean, listen to that hi-hat. It's not bad when he goes to the crash cymbals, but when he's playing the hi-hat, it's extremely loud. Now, the reason for this is that I didn't understand proper microphone placement on my drums back then. Again, that simple article that I read that featured producer Andy Sneap, just that one paragraph of him explaining how he records his cymbals completely changed my life. Now let's hear a production that I recorded 2 years later, again using the exact same microphones, interface, and everything else. Take a listen. Completely different. The cymbal sounds so much smoother, the mix is way clearer and fatter, and the crashes are nice and clear. So not only is the hi-hat smooth, but the crashes pop through the mix like they should. Keep listening. Two completely different results using the exact same gear, recorded in the exact same room. The only difference was my workflow and my knowledge. I was still using the exact same cheapo interface with bad converters, cheap microphones, and an untreated room. So as you can hear, that is a stark contrast. I mean, the microphone placement made a massive difference. And I didn't upgrade my gear. I just upgraded my knowledge. From that point on, I completely changed my approach to recording and mixing, and I focused on education. And honestly, I don't give a crap about gear. I've recorded at a really nice high-end studios and done a ton of recording out of my budget project studio, and my results are always the same. I use the same techniques in both types of studios, and lo and behold, I produce the same results. The problem is when it comes to home studio production, so many of us lack the knowledge that's necessary to produce the results that so many of us want. And we always blame the gear. I know because I used to do this. I just shared with you a real world example in this video. Now I know if you've gotten to this point in the video, you're probably somewhat serious about improving the sound of your productions. And I want you producing better results with the gear you currently use. I don't want you wasting a ton of money like I have. And because of this, right now I'm offering you direct access to my exclusive training, 4 dead simple ways to massively improve your recordings and mixes. In this training, I share with you my #1 technique for prepping guitar tracks that virtually mix themselves. I also share with you how you could create instantaneous clarity within your mixes using any old stock EQ plugin. You'll also learn how to take control over the levels in your mix so that instruments stop fighting with one another. And then finally, I teach you how to craft radio-ready vocal mixes using stock plugins exclusively. Now, full disclosure, if you're one of these people that's constantly on TikTok and you have the attention span of a squirrel, do yourself a favor, Don't waste your time. This training is really in depth. It's almost an hour long, and it's meant for people who are serious about audio production like I was. Now, the training is absolutely free right now, and you can have direct access by clicking the link below in this video's description. Now, home recording, as we know it, has been around for a long time now, well over 20 years. But if you've been paying attention, you probably noticed that a large majority of the home recordings that you hear still sound like home recordings. And it really comes down to the fact that so many of us are making the same mistakes over and over and over again over the course of decades, apparently. Now, if you're interested in learning more about these mistakes so you can avoid them, watch this video. In the video, I clearly outline the mistakes that so many of us make so that you can avoid making these mistakes. If this is you, check out that video. Till next time, drink that Spindrift.